All right, we might have a few more people trickling in, but first, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's a real honor to put these sorts of events on and have the opportunity to engage with you all in this way. And we put together what we hope is a really interesting and relevant program for you all today. And we're looking forward to learning from you guys as well. So first of all, the way we were able to put on this event is really because the state of Connecticut was participating in the 4-H Common Measures project last year, where we developed an annual assessment protocol for our 4-H program. And in that project, I serve as the regional liaison for evaluation for that 4-H Common Measures project. And we have a team of people that's been working in our state to sort of build out our capacity for 4-H evaluation, but then try to transfer that capacity out to other people in our region. And people around the nation right now, each region has a liaison like me, and they have teams that are all working on capacity building in the 4-H program at the national scale. So I guess first and foremost, this funding for today's event comes from the Bechtel Foundation and the 4-H National 4-H Council. And so we're really thankful that they've been willing to support this work over the past 2 years. And with that, I mentioned to a few of you that we pretty much open source all of the materials that we create for these events and for the work that we're doing. We share that information on our website. And so if there's something you're looking for, information you need that you're not seeing, a worksheet that you saw that you want access to, we're more than happy to share all of those materials, because this is really about you. It's about capacity building for our network and making sure that you guys have the resources you need to be successful in your 4-H evaluation endeavors in your states. So our team, our awesome team, we have, we call it the dream team, right? We have Allison Nichols, who was the evaluation specialist in West Virginia and just happened to be moving to Connecticut, and I quickly grabbed her and said, "You're coming with us," right? And so we were able to hire Allison to help us with this project this year and do a couple of other things related to our 4-H evaluation efforts. We have Stacy Stearns, who is the UConn Extension Communications person. She was the one who was talking about the bit.ly links because she's our tech guru and knows all things communication, and she'll be presenting on data visualization later this afternoon. We have Jen Cushman. This is actually her office, and she's sort of been really helpful in sort of getting us this space and providing us with the food and getting us all sorted with the logistics for today. Marianne Fusco-Rollins. Where are you? There, you moved. Miriah has been a member of our team for the last 2 years. She works out of the Tallinn County office, and she is the state program leader for 4-H. So some of you may also be serving in a state 4-H program leader role here. And then there's me. I'm the evaluation specialist here at UConn Extension, and I serve as the regional liaison. So when I went to the registration form, I pulled this information. And in the room today, I mean, maybe if everybody's may or may not be here yet, but we have 9 states of the 12 in our region represented, which I think is awesome. So thank you all who had to travel far to get here. We really value the fact that you traveled to come here. And it's important, I think, for us to sort of get together at these events in this regional way, because I think there's a lot of learning that goes on, but there's also a lot of networking and building of the relationships that occur at these events. And so we've got 9 states. We have over 120 years of collective experience. And I thought that was incredible because, we have everything from people who have been in their 4-H position for less than 6 months, all the way up to people who have been in 4-H for over 30 years. And so we have a lot of collective knowledge in the room today, and we'll be looking to have you guys sort of share your experiences with us throughout the day. And the content for this workshop is really based on our evaluation of last year's workshop and professional development workshop that we did at NAE 4HA. And so the way we came up with the topics that we were going to present today is based on feedback that we received from 4-H educators in our network. And so I kind of wanted to point that out because we're really trying to create these feedback loops. And that's what evaluation is very much about. And so obviously at the end of this event, we will also have an evaluation form and ask you sort of what other topics you might be interested in for future events like this. This first part, if you look at the agenda, is about assessing the audience. And I think it's really important, and when we met as a team, we kind of jumped right into, we knew people wanted to hear a lot about interpreting and analyzing data and reporting and communicating it. But we as a team, knowing what we know, really feel like it really has to start with that audience assessment process for that communication to be effective at the other end. And so this presentation is really about assessing the audience and understanding who your stakeholders are, what their interests and values are. And then we're going to do a little bit of an exercise that will get you thinking about who are your particular stakeholders related to an evaluation question and how do they fall on this sort of scale that I'm going to show you. So a concept that I like to start with is this idea of a value and. Has anybody ever heard this before, a value and? It's sort of a, I don't know, an academic-y evaluator term that was coined by Michael Scriven, who is pretty much the father of evaluation. And it's the idea that when you first start an evaluation project, you really need to think about what is it that you are evaluating? What is that topic? What is that project? What is that question? What is that program? You know, what is the actual thing that you want to evaluate? And that becomes your evaluand, or I would call it like evaluee, right? That thing that you're evaluating. And I think it's important to start with that because sometimes we get ahead of ourselves and we're like, we want to do this and we want to do that and we want to do this. But really, it's really important to first and foremost understand what is that question you have, what is that program you want to assess, and really put some boundaries on it. Because as you may have experienced, and sometimes people get frustrated with evaluation because they had too many questions, they were evaluating too many things, and they didn't do the work of actually determining, you know, this evaluation is about this specific product or this specific program. And sometimes it makes a lot of sense to sort of specify what that evaluand is before jumping into the methodological approach. And so anytime I'm starting an evaluation, I think about these questions. And to me, being an evaluator is all about questions. It's about formulating good questions and figuring out how to answer those questions. And so when I'm starting with an evaluation program, I think about, okay, you know, what are the goals of this evaluation? You know, what am I trying to achieve? What is that evaluand? And how will those goals be determined? So, you know, in our state, we do a lot of things through group work and collective knowledge, sort of bringing a bunch of people together and really formulating what the goals of an evaluation project might be. And so you kind of have to think through sort of what is the process that you want to use to develop these goals. And then how do you plan to use the evaluation data? You're going to hear me talk a lot about evaluation data use because it really is an important concept when you're thinking about how that evaluation data then has meaning at the end of the day. And so, you know, we always like to take a use-first approach in our state. How will those evaluation goals be met? When we think about the evaluation process here in Connecticut, we think about how do we collect, analyze, and communicate that data. And if we're not doing all three of those things, and we're not thinking about how we're going to set out to collect, analyze, and communicate data early on in the process, then sometimes things fall through the cracks along the way. And then who has stake? This really matters a lot, and that's what this session is really about, in determining, you know, who are those audiences that might use or have interest in that data. So like, who is the data going to affect, either directly or indirectly? And thinking about those things early on as you're formulating what that evaluand is and what that methodological process is that's going to help you answer that evaluation question. So what is a stakeholder? I like this sort of general definition, one who is involved in or affected by a course of action. And so when I think about a stakeholder, it might not be somebody who's necessarily doing something hands-on with me, but I like to think about, well, if I have these findings, I don't know necessarily what the findings are going to be yet, but I have to be really forward-thinking about how might these findings affect different audiences? How might the findings impact different groups of people? And thinking about that early is really important. So utilization-focused evaluation is a concept developed by Michael Quinn Patton, who is sort of followed on the School of Scriven and has developed a different kind of more participatory approach to doing evaluation. And in many cases, we rely on his work to sort of guide how we do our evaluation here in Connecticut. And so Michael Quinn Patton talks about a number of different intended uses that different audiences might have for the data you're creating. And there might be an instrumental use. An instrumental use is when there's a particular decision that's going to be made or a particular thing that has to happen at the end of that evaluation. A decision is going to be made, and that evaluation is going to inform that decision, and it's instrumental in that way to inform that decision. Conceptual use is similar in that it's just really for the sake of inquiry. Maybe there's no decision to be made at the end. It's really just maybe understanding at a conceptual level how knowledgeable that audience is, or how much knowledge they gained as a result of your program. And so maybe there's no decision at the end, but certainly the collection of that data maybe is used for formative improvement of that program in some way over time, but there's no distinct use at the end. And then process use is when you have an evaluation effort that is really designed to help improve the evaluation methodology. So for example, in our state, we've done this project where we implement an annual evaluation of all of the members in our 4-H database. And so part of what we were doing is sort of a process use approach where we're just trying to figure out how do we effectively do this annual evaluation process. And our evaluation process is all about just informing how well that evaluation process worked. Then persuasive use, which I imagine some of you might want to use evaluation for. Persuasive use is really important because this is what you're talking about with the funders, right? This is when you're doing evaluation for the purpose of getting that funding, proving that concept, trying to convince legislators that this project or this program is really valuable and they should support it in some way. And so there's this whole persuasive use. And then at the end, I really like this because Michael Quinn Patton really points out that in many cases, the use is actually non-use, right? That we're just going to collect evaluation data for the sake of having evaluation data, or the misuse, and that is that you're going to collect this evaluation data, but you're just going to interpret it in some inappropriate way to sort of fit a goal that you have. And so he really warns about this non-use and misuse categorization, and encourages people to think early about if you feel like you're going down this pathway of I'm just collecting evaluation data for the sake of collecting evaluation data, halt. Stop what you're doing immediately, reformulate, figure out what you need to do in terms of the first 4, and then start to develop your process from there. Because if you're just collecting evaluation data for the sake of collecting evaluation data, something you might be doing that you're not even aware of is actually lowering people's trust in the evaluation data you might want to collect later on. And so, we really care about making sure that people who participate in our evaluation process see the direct impact of their participation. And we're going to talk a lot about how we close the loop using communication today. But it's really important that you just don't put that onus on your participants to get that data and then you never do anything with it. It really erodes trust and legitimacy of the evaluation process. So who are these intended users? So these are sort of big groups, and we're going to be working with these big groups, and you can start thinking about now, how might your individual groups fall into these different categories in the activity we're going to do. But oftentimes, we're looking for this use by policymakers and decision makers. In our state, every year, we do a one-pager that just depicts some of the key findings from our annual evaluation, and we print it out and we hand it to legislators in our state so that they have a really quick and easy way to look at our data and respond to it and either support our program or share our program with other people. Program sponsors, certainly, Bechtel Foundation and the National 4-H Council, they, want us to use the data, right? And so in many cases, program sponsors are giving you that funding so that you can actually yield that data that they are going to use to either determine whether or not they should fund something further, fund something different, those sorts of decisions. Same thing with evaluation sponsors. target participants. So this is a big category, and you can think about how many different target participants you might have in a state. And that's why, kind of going back to that evaluand concept, it's really important to have a really good idea of what that is, because when you get to determining who that target participant group is, it's going to be a lot easier to do if you really have a good idea of what your evaluation and of what your evaluand is and what your goals are of that evaluation. Of course, there's program managers and program staff that might be making decisions based on those evaluation findings, either tinkering with programs, providing additional resources, things like that that might happen as a result. And the competitors, I like this one, right? There are, a lot of times people will pick up your data and say, oh, well, this is what this state's doing versus this state. And so, sometimes it's really about, the use of that data might be used by your competitors, and thinking about that and knowing how to handle that is important. And then contextual stakeholders, the idea that there's all these groups sort of peripheral to maybe your intended purpose, but that you might want to think about those indirect effects that might influence different contextual stakeholders. And of course, the evaluation and research community. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about process use and evaluation, that's where that information about how did the process work. In our situation, we've developed this annual assessment process using common measures, and that is really valuable to us because the whole intention of doing that was so that we could take that model and give it back to the evaluation and research community and provide people with guidance on how to actually do that. And so in our case, the use was really about giving back to this evaluation community in that way. So this is a diagram that is called the influence interest diagram or model. And it's funny because I've known about this for probably the better part of 20 years. And when I went to go source an actual citation for it, I could not find one. It's become such general knowledge in the stakeholder assessment field that nobody even really knows where it even came from. It's just sort of what we do as, needs assessors or people who know how to assess stakeholder audiences. So this model is really showing us that when it comes to determining who your stakeholders are and your stakeholder audiences, not everybody needs to be communicated with or engaged in the same way. And I think that's sort of something that people run into sometimes and are sort of fearful in the evaluation process is, it's just become so cumbersome because you have all these different stakeholders and you need to engage them in all these different ways. And I think this is a really good tool for helping to sort of differentiate who those stakeholder groups are and how you need to manage them accordingly throughout the evaluation process. So if you think about this a little bit, I say power, maybe, other models will show an influence terminology. But the idea is that as power goes up, right, that's maybe decision-making power, power to utilize or use the findings from that data. And then on this, on the x-axis, we've got interest. So the people who are highly powerful, have a lot of influence, and have a lot of interest, this is going to be your key stakeholder group, right? These are the people you want to engage all the time, early and often. They become your core team, your key stakeholders, and you want to manage them closely. You work as a team with that group. Versus people who maybe don't have a lot of power. They may or may not even be able to use the actual data that's being collected, but they have a lot of interest. And so, keeping that group informed, keeping them abreast of what's going on, keeping them sort of knowing what's happening throughout the process, and then also maybe letting them sort of chime in or participate, engage when you feel it's appropriate and when there's space for them to help you make a decision. Yes?
Who are their latents?
The latents are the highly powerful but don't have a lot of interest. I would call these like state legislators, right? They have a lot of decision-making power and a lot of influence over what happens in our state, but they're not necessarily super interested in the methodological approach that we use for our evaluation. And so they would be the latent category. And then there's apathetics, which is sort of they aren't very interested. They don't have a lot of influence or power, and sort of, they're just sort of here. And the reason why it says monitor is because the idea is that this group, while they might be that way right now, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be like that forever. And so you might have a group that you want to monitor that they might decide they want to become, more informed over time, or they might move into a position that gives them a little bit of influence and power that you then want to, engage with them on. Does that all make sense? And it's just a way of sort of a topology, a way of classifying groups so that you're kind of taking it down to a level of, I don't have to engage all these stakeholder audiences in the same way. And I think when you're doing strategic communication, this is a starting point to understand how then do you communicate effectively with each of these quadrants. And then some other questions I always like to ask myself are, what is the level of awareness? How aware are people of that program or the evaluation process? What existing attitudes or perceptions do they already have about it? In some cases, you actually have to measure these things, right, through a needs assessment. And sometimes you could just sort of use your gut check to determine. It depends on the nature of the project. But really, having an idea of how people think about or how interested they are with your project is important. How satisfied are they? Certainly when you start a process like this, you want to know, are people incredibly dissatisfied? Because you want to know that going into the situation, that you have to sort of switch that up, and you're going to have to work maybe a little bit harder if people are already existing, already have existing dissatisfaction with the process or the program. What is their intention to use the data? Again, that use focus comes back, and thinking about, all right, how might those individuals or those groups use the data we're collecting? Back to that trust aspect of, how trusting are they of that data? And certainly in our state, we do a lot of work to make sure that the data we're collecting and the data we're putting out there is rigorous and it's valid and it's reliable. And so, we do that because we want people to trust in our process and trust that the data we're giving to them is legitimate and it's real. And we live in this sort of information era where people are getting bombarded by these things all the time. And so we want people to look to us as a trusted source for information. And then how will the findings affect their well-being or their lifestyle? And so, that's really where the rubber hits the road. When people start to be individually affected by something that you're doing, you really want to be aware of that so that you can make sure that you're navigating that complexity appropriately. So, in the end, best practices include identifying stakeholders, figuring out where they might fall on that quadrant scale that I gave you, establishing a structure then for communicating with each of those groups in each of those quadrants effectively, involving the key stakeholders early, so the people that are in that upper right-hand group, right, high influence and power, high interest, you want to get them involved from day one. You want to keep them involved throughout the process, and then you want to keep them involved in an active way, engage. You want them to actually be meaningfully contributing to the process. And then communicating effectively throughout becomes incredibly important for making sure that the evaluation or the stakeholder assessment process happens well. Those are some references. Those are 3 books that I really love and use a lot when I'm talking about stakeholder assessment.